Hello, this is Angie Yingst, and you're listening to Centered, grounded conversations about the metaphysical. Blessed Vernal Equinox friends, it's Angie Yingst, and I'm here with your Vernal Equinox reading and history and insights around Vernal Equinox, or what modern pagans would call Ostara. I should say modern Wiccans. So I want a disclaimer for this episode, and I'm just going to start by saying I nerd out on religious and cultural history of Vernal Equinox in the spring and this time of year. So I'm going to talk about other holidays and other holidays within Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism. I am not any of those religions, and I tend to try to give sacred text context, not for preachiness, just so if you want to go back to source, you can. So one thing to know is that I have a degree in religion. So we tend to say that theologians, of which I'm not, focus on what God thinks about humans, and religion scholars focus on what humans think about God. So I'm kind of coming from the latter of these. And in this quest to kind of put things into context, I go to the source. So I'm going to do my best, and I just want you to know I was raised Catholic, so I'm going to come from that point of view too. I consider myself a pagan or an earth-based spirituality. So I'm kind of an earth-worshiping, tree-hugging, faithful and faith-filled believer in God and the goddess. And I often will say God to mean it all. And I want you to know that because I don't want to mislead anyone. I tend to start talking about religions and get a little geeky, and it may sound like I am like part of that religion, which I am not. So, but I do tend to have a pluralistic view of religions where I kind of see us all going to different paths to similar places. So, I just want to say that too, because some people find that offensive in and of itself. So I am very detached from the religious part, and I want that to be very clear. And I literally could talk about religion all day, and maybe I will some episode. So there is not one traditional religious or cultural system where you would find all 8 pagan or Wiccan Shabbats as a holiday system, except for Wicca. So Wicca sought to reestablish the link to the earth, to the cycle of the seasons, by following what Wiccans call the Wheel of the Year. So celebrations known as Shabbats serve as the spokes in the wheel, reminding Wiccans of their intimate connection with nature. And so when we talk about the Shabbats, we talk about the lesser Shabbats, which are tied to the solstices and equinoxes, and then the greater Shabbats, which were purportedly tied to harvest and livestock cycles. And they happen every 6 weeks. So they go right between the equinoxes and the solstices. So the Shabbats, and then there's Esbats, which are rituals that take place at the new and full moons. And so that's what Wiccans celebrate. And this came about in the 1950s with the creation of Wicca by Gerald Gardner. So Ostara was one of those holy days that Gardner solidified for pagans, but it actually celebrated the vernal equinox. And prior to Gardner, there was no Ostara. There wasn't a celebration that was like an old, celebration called Ostara or something. But Gardner named Ostara after Eostre, Eostre, the Germanic goddess of the spring. Others say she's also Celtic, but she's celebrated at vernal equinox. And so so many other spring celebrations and cultures, Ostara symbolized and symbolizes fertility, rebirth, and renewal. The time of year was marking the beginning of the agricultural cycle. So farmers would be planting seeds about now. So, one of the things why, Angie, do you follow the Wheel of the Year if you're not Wiccan? Well, it is tied to the agricultural calendar. It is intimately tied to the earth. And I follow it because I believe that when we follow cycles, the cycles of the earth, the cycles of the moon, that we align our spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical work with what the earth is asking us to do. So, I think one of the messages I've been getting so much in my meditations and in my journeys is this idea of being separate, that we're all one. And what my teacher called the myth of separation, the myth that we're all different, the myth that there's me and you and we're separate beings and we have different needs and wants and blah, blah, blah. This idea of like being one with everything also means being of the earth. We put ourselves in buildings because, honestly, we aren't made to be outside all the time. We can find structures and caves and all that going back to the beginning of humanity because we aren't covered with fur. We aren't built to be sleeping outside. Okay? So I'm not saying that your house isn't part of nature. But because of that, because we separate ourselves, we watch nature on our phones and on our TVs and on our computers, we don't always go out and experience it, we can be kind of detached from the idea that we are also of the earth. We are also animals on the earth. And to me, celebrating these cycles of the earth, I mean, celebrating the cycles within myself, within all of you. And so I feel like we do better work when we align with these different points on the wheel of the year. And I really like the way they're honored out. Every 6 weeks we're doing work. We're thinking about what would be happening, what's happening on the earth. How am I attached to that? What am I doing here to like maximize that? So, okay. There isn't much written before the 8th century regarding Ostara, the goddess. But when the Venerable Bede, the 6th, 7th century British historian, mentions her, he mentions that Easter is named after her, which is interesting. So Ostara later appears in 19th century folk tales and is associated with rabbits, hares. And in medieval Europe, the March hare was seen as a fertility symbol and a sign of spring, which is why rabbits and hares have become the symbol of not only Ostara, but Easter and spring and all of those things. And the reason is this species of rabbit in Europe is nocturnal for most of the year. But in March, during mating season, it mates during the day. So the March hares are seen all day long, whereas they wouldn't necessarily be seen all year. And, the other part is the female hare. Sorry about that. The female hare can get pregnant with a second litter while it's still pregnant with the first litter. So they just kept having babies and babies and babies. And they were used as symbols of fertility, which is what, any farmer, harvester, agricultural society wants. They want their fields to be fertile. They want lots of harvest that lasts their whole year. Okay, so there isn't much evidence that Celtic people celebrated Ostara as it's thought of now. They, though, along with many other cultures, honored the coming of spring. So Wicca brought the concepts into the Wiccan holiday of Ostara. But Christians celebrate, obviously, and we're going to talk about this a little more, the resurrection, the rebirth of Jesus Christ. Jewish people celebrate Passover, honoring the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. So Christian Easter is dependent on Passover's date. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, okay? But there's holidays celebrated all over the world. Okay, so we're talking about Druids, Mayans, Native Americans honored vernal equinox at different sacred sites where the sun would hit at a precise place to honor the rebirth of the sun. Druids had their holy day called Alban Eiler, translated as the light of the sun, of the earth, Bacchanalia, the ancient Greek festival of physical pleasure, honored the gods Bacchus and Dionysus, or Dionysus, Roman Bacchus, Greek Dionysus, and was celebrated in March. As part of the ancient Greek and Roman religions, Persephone returned from the underworld of vernal equinox, and her mother Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, then started to allow crops to grow again. And she calls back the goddesses petulance and famine. And so, that whole story is a very interesting story, which I think I told at the autumn equinox. So you can go back and listen to that. But if you work with the triple goddess, if you are goddess focused, this is a time we work with the maiden aspect of the goddess. And her ritual is menstruation. So some people will use this time to reconnect their womb space with the earth. And so they'll pour their menstrual blood into their crops and into the soil. And this was part of the sacrifices that were made for crops and for Mother Earth and for Father Sky or for the gods. The soil was mixed with the blood of the sacrifice. And, that's kind of an interesting concept. So the ancient, let's just go back to religious history. The ancient Babylonians and Zoroastrians celebrate New Year on vernal equinox. And that makes the most sense. To me, at least, it does. To start New Year when everything starts to bloom and you start planning things. But if you look at the astrological calendar, which starts with Aries, that's why. The calendar used to begin with the Babylonian festival of Akitu and Akitu or something like that. It was celebrated the rebirth of the natural world. So rebirth is a huge theme at this time of year, no matter what religion you are. So the first full moon in March, Hindus also celebrate Holi. And Jewish people also celebrate Purim. They're both cultures based on lunar calendars. Lunar calendars, why Easter changes every year, if you didn't know that, because Easter is based on the Gregorian calendar, and many Eastern Orthodox churches follow the Julian calendar rather than the Gregorian. So that's why Eastern Orthodox Easter takes place at a different time as other Christian Easters. So Easter Sunday is the resurrection of Jesus. That's what it's honoring. And it happens on the first Sunday after the Paschal full moon. So what is the Paschal or Paschal full moon? Paschal comes from Pascha, a transliteration of the Aramaic word Passover. And Pascha also in the Hebrew word is Pesach. And I don't know if I pronounced that right. They both mean Passover. Okay. So this is specifically the first Sunday following the full moon, which occurs on or after the spring equinox. And there's some weird Christian stuff. Like if it's exactly on that Sunday, it's the following Sunday because Passover happens at the full moon. It happens at that time. So going back to the Hebrew Bible, the story of the first Passover is basically Moses is telling the Israelites to slaughter a Passover lamb and paint its blood on the door. And the idea was, this comes from Exodus, and the idea is that God would protect the Israelites from death and pass over their doors. So they would not allow someone that was going to kill them to come into the house if they painted blood on their door of the Passover lamb. Pass over me, okay? That's what that comes from. So in the New Testament, Paul connected Christ to Passover because he refers to Jesus as the Paschal lamb who's sacrificed for people's salvation. And so the whole sacrificial system established in the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. If you don't know that, the Jews, Jesus was Jewish. He was a Jew. And so, when there's kind of a promise of a Messiah, Jesus is supposed to be that Messiah. Now, Jews don't think Jesus was the Messiah. They're staying Jewish. They're still waiting. If they're waiting, a lot of people don't even talk about that. Whereas, so, and I say that because a lot of the stories in the New Testament are trying to connect Jesus to the Messiah ideas that are coming in from the Old Testament. Okay. So, they're basically saying Jesus is the sacrifice for the original sin. At least that's what Catholics believe. and opens up like the doors of heaven now. We're not always holding the sin of Eve, which is the eating from the tree of knowledge. There's a lot there, guys. Okay? The tree of knowledge, we're not allowed to eat from it. Think about it. Okay. So probably the most known story is Isaac and Abraham in the Old Testament, which is, I think, in the Torah, I think it's in Genesis. I mean, I know it's in Genesis. Okay, I'm going to go with it. God asked Abraham, so Abraham and Sarah are childless. They have infertility. And then God says, okay, you can get pregnant. They're 80. And he has a son named Isaac, who is by all counts beautiful and awesome and blah, blah, blah. And then God, to prove Abraham's faith, asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And it's like his only son, and Sarah, his wife, would be freaking devastated, but he does it. He's going up to the mountain to kill Abraham, and he's there about to kill Abraham, and God's like, I wouldn't make you do that. I mean, this is traumatic, even if he stops him, right? And says basically you can sacrifice a ram instead. So the idea of sacrifice is this test of faith, right? So, interestingly, and a lot of, if you don't read philosophy, a lot of philosophers were Christian, right? And so they deal with some of these things. One of them that's really interesting is Soren Kierkegaard's book, Fear and Trembling. He takes the story of Isaac and Abraham and says, what kind of God does this? And what does it mean for us that our God asks us to do this? Okay, that's interesting. I thought it was interesting anyway. I love that book. So the imagery of sacrifice and lamb are really important when proving that Jesus is the Messiah, okay? Lambs were sacrificed at the temple in Jerusalem every morning when in Exodus. So Jewish people studied that and understand the imagery of the lamb, understand the imagery of sacrifice. And that's important, because the idea of rebirth is important. It's that these sacrifices are made so we can be born into a new way of being. So Christians can be born into a new way of being, or so Jewish people can be born into a new way of being. So the things that are pointed out as Jesus's divinity were also things that were very familiar to Jewish people, Jewish religious scholars. And they also were important to Hellenized people who lived in the Middle East at the time, because they also have the stories of the hero birth, the virgin birth. So if you look at the four, I forget what they call them, congruent Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, they're all written about the same thing. They're all written about Jesus. Some of them tell the same stories in different ways. Why? Because their audience was different. Mark was really aimed at converting Jews. Matthew and Luke are both aimed more at Romans or Hellenized people or Gentiles, and then John is really focused on more of like the mystical aspects of Judaism and Gentile religions. Okay. So at any rate, the important part of the story of Jesus and rebirth is this idea that he was Jewish. So that's why Easter is so connected with Passover, because the Last Supper is a Passover dinner. Okay. And so that makes sense. He was eating matzah, which is unleavened bread, which is what the hosts are in Catholic Church. So when you take communion, you're eating unleavened bread. You're eating matzah, basically. So if you want to know what matzah tastes like and you've taken communion, you know what matzah tastes like. Because that was the thing. At the dinner, Jesus says, takes the matzah and says, this is my body. And he takes the wine and says, this is my blood. And so when you take those things in, you also have a piece of me, right? I'm with you. I'm in you. So that's part of the Paschal mystery, so to speak. So if you're Catholic, Good Friday, the day that Jesus dies, is really important, because and we talk about this a lot, like when you're reading tarot or whatever, and when you talk about death, we don't want to blow over the actual death part, and that's like part of, I think Catholicism is really focused on the fact that Jesus died. He was a human who gave his life. So liberating Catholics from original sin meant that Jesus made this ultimate sacrifice of suffering and death. So it's an important day for Catholics, at least, a lot of Christians. It's a day of fasting in Catholicism, prayer, and mourning. And on Good Friday, what is commemorated are the Stations of the Cross, which are like the 14-step devotion that basically goes through all of the specific events of Jesus's last day, beginning with his condemnation and then going through like when, he's condemned and then he's betrayed by the Pharisee, he's betrayed by the Jewish leaders and he's given to Pilate and Pilate condemns him. Then he has to walk, and it's this whole pilgrimage. And so in Catholic churches, all the stained glass windows often, not always, but many of the stained glass windows are depicting the Stations of the Cross. So you'll sometimes see the, 7 windows on each side. Other times they're made like, basically like little icons or images throughout the church. So a lot of times people just ignore them because they don't really know what that is. But what they are is telling the story of Jesus's death. Okay. So Good Friday and his sacrifice basically for everyone. And so there is this kind of idea with the rebirth, that death has to come. And it happens, we are celebrating that in the Wheel of the Year from Samhain on. Basically, we're celebrating the dark time. And Samhain is really, really important for that. But we really kind of feel this rebirth now at the vernal equinox. And so like, basically in Catholicism and Christianity, Lent is that beginning time where you're giving up, you're sacrificing. Okay, you're doing a sacrifice of something that brings pleasure. Okay, it used to be food, and what it would be is that Wednesdays and Fridays you wouldn't eat meat. That would be the fasting in the Catholic Church, at least. But right now, I think what they really say is just a reduction in food. Some people, my mom always says we just ate bland, yucky, like broth, like whatever. It's like nothing, abstinence from everything, Now, there's a focus on abstaining from alcohol, from social media, from TV, from, just like abstaining from modernity in some ways. And on Good Friday, because they're celebrating death, there's like no mass necessarily, but usually the Stations of the Cross are done. And if you have communion, it's because it was consecrated on Holy Thursday, not Good Friday. So Easter, when we talk about it, is the rebirth of Jesus. It's when he went to heaven. And so this is the common theme of the rebirth. But I think it's important also to know that these religions also have celebrated death. Now, Christianity wraps it all up in those 40 days, but those on the pagan Wheel of the Year have been celebrating that death of the crops, letting things, go fallow. All of those things, are very important. Now, I talked about Holi earlier, and that's a Hindu holiday. That also celebrates the arrival of spring and love and fertility, and it's known as a festival of colors. A little bit different of a feeling than the solemnness of, we call it Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday. Holy Saturday is completely silent in the church. That's a mourning day. But Holi is completely different. It's a festival of colors, and people gather powdered dye in all these different colors and throw it at each other. And how Holi came to be was a legend that deals with the god Krishna and his wife Radha. And to understand the story, you need to know that Krishna had blue skin. Okay. And so Krishna fell in love with Radha, and however was totally worried about the fact that they had different skin colors. And he told his mother about his concerns, and then she told him to go to Radha and ask her to paint his face any color she wanted. So doing this made Krishna less self-conscious, and then they fell in love. And some people still do this, paint their faces, and you see these awesome pictures of the colors flying. I love that celebration, because there is a lot of love. Fertility is about unions. That isn't really the energy of Ostara or Vernal Equinox. That's more Beltane, which comes on May 1st. But, equinox literally translates to equal night in Latin. So it's not true for every part of the world, but indicates that the sun's aligned with the equator. So, we are talking about getting more light, another connection with light. But right now they're equal, okay? So after Yule, the earth tilts towards the sun, which extends our day. And this becomes much more transparent after vernal equinox, when sunlight extends the day and the plants begin responding. I mean, my plants are putting out babies all over the place. They pop buds, flowers. You're probably seeing little buds if you're in northern hemisphere. Of course, in the southern hemisphere, what we're talking about now is autumn equinox, because they're going into their fallow time. So they're the ones going to start celebrating death and honoring death. But I'm in the northern hemisphere. I tend to talk about the northern hemisphere. You can always go back to the autumn one if you're in the southern hemisphere and listen to that. But life seems reborn after the fallow months of winter. The rebirth is important. Okay? The themes of Ostara are a return to light, an emergence, a balance, hope, fertility, growth, new beginnings. This is a traditional time to set intentions and begin projects. And we are squarely in the east on the medicine wheel. So we work with the allies of rabbit, because rabbits always symbolize fertility and growth, as we talked about earlier. And it's not just because of their prodigious skills in procreation. But they also accomplish a lot. As a prey animal, they work through fear, vulnerability, anxiety. So if you think about how a rabbit exists, always on high alert, they're watching and listening for any shifting of energy, and then they run, right? So that heightened sense of danger doesn't keep the rabbit from reproducing and from creating and from putting yourself out there. So, in the city, in the country, in the woods, in the pastures, you'll see rabbits exploring and creating more bunnies. And so for people who are creative, who are working as writers and artists and producers of things, this is a really great ally to work with, bunny and rabbit, because many introverted artists are afraid to share their artwork. They feel vulnerable, they feel fear, they feel anxiety. And so rabbit can be a really great ally that you work through that anxiety and fear and vulnerability and still put their work out there. They still do it even when they're afraid. I mean, to me, that's the definition of courage, but we don't usually say, oh yes, what's courageous? The rabbit, So let's talk about journal prompts. What aspect of yourself are you ready to rebirth? This is a great question to ask yourself if you're doing a reading at the vernal equinox. You can ask yourself what you've released, what you're ready to call in, and what needs balance. And of course, this is a great time to do any creative projects, asking what's ready to get started, how's this going to work, what are you ready to start incubating? So because vernal equinox moves us into new light energy, we can really work with those symbols of light. We can work with flowers and eggs. And one of the rituals that I've heard people do, and I'd like to share with you, is you basically take these journal questions, maybe, what aspect of yourself you're ready to rebirth, what are you releasing, what are you ready to call in, what needs balanced, and you take a hard-boiled egg and a marker, okay, and you find a place outside your home or a place where you can be alone in nature, and you find a place to connect with new growth, okay? Maybe it's under a tree that's budding or flowering, or a place where daffodils are blooming, and you sit on the earth, okay? And if you're doing this meditation at another point of the year, because you can definitely do this anytime, you just go wherever new growth is represented to you, okay? So wherever that is. And you just begin with these questions and sit in meditation and then journal and connect with the earth. and your own breath. And once you're in that meditative state, just read the question and answer it. And sometimes the message is very loud and clear. Sometimes it's just that we have to sit still. And so you're basically closing your eyes, preparing for the next question, then do the question and journal until you get a clear idea of the answer. Okay? Then take your egg. You hold it. Visualize what you're ready to call in. If you have Reiki or some other healing modality, you can send that to the egg. And if you're called, you can write an intention or draw a symbol on the egg of the energy you're ready to call in. And as you hold the egg, you can say, as light increases, so does my intention. As I will it, so mote it be. And visualize the egg kind of glowing with golden light, and then bury it in that place. You can also just bury it near the front door. That's like a little spelly thing to do. And we can kind of work with the affirmation of I welcome in new growth. I welcome in new energy. I am ready. I create my reality. I rebirth into light. Any of those things would be good affirmations. Now let's do the reading. I pulled out the Ostara spread from my book, and that's what I'm doing for this. So our first one, actually, this is a little different because the first card is at the bottom. And why that is because I wanted it to kind of feel like a plant growing. So the first one is the intention you set, either consciously or unconsciously. And the card that came up is the Ten of Swords reversed. And the Ten of Swords is the card of rebirth. It is a card of death, okay? So I part of the reason I really wanted to focus on talking about the death aspect of the story of Jesus and the passion of Jesus is because we often will jump over that, I got to let it go. Cool, I let it go, I'm moving on. Part of letting go is grieving. And part of letting go is feeling the weight of betrayal, the weight of hurt. And the Ten of Swords really represents this. I mean, it's a guy with 10 swords in his back. And, one thing Rachel Pollack always says, it's really interesting to me, is like, this seems a little self-pitying and dramatic, like you only need one sword to kill someone. Why are there 10 swords in there? And I think that is a representation of how our mind thinks about death, thinks about betrayal. You didn't just stab me once and let me for dead. You made it hurt, This idea that all of our chakras get blocked, there's a sword in every chakra kind of. He was betrayed by many people, by many things. So, I think, if we don't think about it consciously all the time, this is a really good time to kind of bring forth those things, those feelings of betrayal and wanting to be rebirthed, and think about like the weight of the grief of that. I had a friend, we were talking and she said something like, this is where abandonment comes from. And I was like, right, exactly. Like we have to feel the weight of the betrayal. We deal with the wound, like example, like the orphan medicine, for example, might come from abandonment. We'll deal with the orphan medicine, but do we deal with the grief of being abandoned? This is a time, this is the card that basically is like, you feel it. And then remembering that the rebirth is important. So our intention that we're really setting right now and that we should be thinking about is to really feel the weight of betrayal that's happened to us and the want for a new dawn, for a rebirth. I want to really deal with that and let it go. I want to deal with it so I don't ever pick it up again. Do you ever, and this is just like me sharing, like, do you ever have those things, like maybe it's one or two incidents in your life, okay, that it's like been many years or something, but it's always like a black and blue that you can push. So like when you're feeling angry, lonely, hungry, tired, sick, overworked, used, any of those things, you kind of go back to that and it's like, oh yeah, there's my comfortable place of feeling betrayed by that or upset by that or saddened by that or I wish I could have said this by that. One of the things that I think is, when this quote I heard was like, forgiveness is not trying to change the past. And so I think that's part of what this card can represent. You're putting swords in it. You're killing it. It's dead. How do you do that? You feel the feelings. You get angry when you're supposed to get angry. And you move to the next place, which is the new dawn. I got to focus on this next place. The gratitude we have for being rid of something that didn't want us, or a situation that didn't serve us, or a friend that wasn't kind to us, that didn't deserve our love to begin with. So our intention now is to rebirth from this, okay? Now, our next place is what feeds this intention. Well, judgment comes in. So we have a higher calling. Judgment shows Archangel Gabriel blowing his horn, calling the dead home, right? Like, now you rise up. Now is the time that you get to live the call of the divine, okay? The rebirth. This is the rebirth time. I mean, it literally shows us rebirthing after death. So it's very interesting that our intention is death here, even though it's reversed. I mean, the Ten of Swords reversed is often the relief from that suffering. We have this suffering, we have this pain, the betrayal in our back, and when it's reversed, it's like we get to lift that up. Okay, we get to let all the swords fall out of our back, as Rachel Pollack says. So we get to move to the next place, and that is, what is our higher calling? We don't have to figure out why things happen to us. We don't have to figure out, like, why did that person betray me? We can just, like, let it be, and just be like, okay, cool. They betrayed me. I got it. I don't need to know anything else. And just go to, like, but what do I need to know? Like, where is it taking me? One of the things that I've gone through, where it's taken me is to be so appreciative of people who talk to me, who appreciate me, who want to be my ally and my friend, not people who are setting me up for failure, right? So that's important. Now, our next position is the past, so the shadow issues around our intention. And so when we rebirth, and we follow our calling, whatever that is, sometimes, like, we think about calling, and I think this is where that shadow issue comes in. We got the Page of Pentacles. Sometimes we're like, oh, this is my calling. I have to monetize it. No, that's what this reading is saying. This isn't about monetizing something. This isn't about having a new career. This isn't about any of that. What is your calling? Maybe your calling is to be a very good daughter and mother. Or maybe it is about being a decent friend or a worker among workers. Or maybe it is just being honest and authentic to the self. And maybe it will one day become a career, but right now it's following the call despite the fact that you might not make any money at it. That's not what it's about, right? Sometimes it's just understanding our identity, our sexuality, our relationships, what our parenting style is, what our religion is, whatever. What is the calling that you're listening to? Yes, some people do get a calling to ministry or to chaplainness, whether that's Christian or not, to help others. But most of us get a calling of just like, let me live in harmony, Let's not think about how I monetize that. Because the next one is the light issues around this intention. The Two of Wands comes in reversed. Now, the Two of Wands is about planning the future and getting it all right and, looking at the past, looking at the present. That's, I think the light issue around this is not to think about the future, but to stay present in the calling. This is work for you. Your calling is for you. It doesn't mean it has to be something that you monetize, something that you plan the future around, something that you're just being present with that calling right now. What does your higher self, what do your guides, if you believe in God or goddess, what do they want of you? How are you of service for them? A lot of times that's self-care. And I got the message this week in my meditations that caring for the earth is self-care, So you can think about tending the earth as being part of this process, okay? I think it's important anyway. But then we look at our outcome here, and the Knight of Wands comes in. The Knight of Wands is this brave, fiery, creative, motivated person. It's an active, moving forward, knowing who we are. The fieriness, the creativeness, that fertility comes through the wands in the fire sign. So we're moving forward with that bravery. And knights are just awesome. Like when we start embodying knight energy, we have a fearlessness about us, right? We don't give a crap what anybody thinks of us. We just do us. Isn't that the biggest calling we have? Is to be as authentic to ourselves as humanly possible. So this is your reading for the vernal equinox. I hope you enjoyed it. And I come in at all of the points in the wheel of the year and cycles to do readings. So thank you so much for being part of that with me. Do you like this reading, and do you like working with the cycles? Well, if you do, just know that I have a membership group called the Moon and Stone Healing Membership Group. We have a private Facebook page, and I share a reading at the new moon and the full moon. It's a collective reading for my members, and I also do a shamanic journey every month with the tarot and earth medicine of the month. I do little things throughout the week, and we do coffee and cards on Friday mornings, and we pull some cards. Sometimes we just talk. It's a circle, and it's a nice sacred space, and I love it. So if you want to work some more with me one-on-one, I have one-on-one appointments. You can book those through my website. On March 20th, I am having an online vernal equinox cacao ceremony and earth medicine healing circle. So I'm doing a distance healing circle and cacao. I do live Q&As at the end of the month, last Wednesday of the month from 6 to 7:30. We're going to be meeting on Zoom, and I'm going to be answering questions live. Some people posted questions before. That's cool. I'm also doing a Beltane Distance Collective Earth Medicine Healing on May 1st, and that's on Zoom as well. It'll be May 1st at 12 p.m. We're going to kind of do that ceremony, and then the Q&As are continuing. Thank you so much for being part of my community.
Thanks for listening to Centered with me, Angie Yingst. If you'd like to send me a question or comment about this show or any shows, you can send them to Angie@themoonandstone.com.